A millionaire businessman stopped in traffic and saw a scene that shook him. A skinny girl holding two babies in her arms. The poor girl, with trembling arms and a steady gaze, held two hungry babies. The millionaire tried to help, but didn't expect what she said next. "If I can't take care of both anymore, would you take one?" In that moment, his world stood still. The first ray of sunlight was still struggling to penetrate the dusty windows of the abandoned building when Isabella woke to the piercing cry of one of the babies. At 11 years old, her eyes already carried the weight of someone who knew, responsibilities she should never have known. She quickly got up from the torn mattress where she slept and walked to the corner where the 8-month-old twins slept in cardboard boxes lined with old blankets. Michael was crying forcefully, his little face red and his tiny fists clenched. Next to him, Ryan still slept deeply, oblivious to his brother's desperation. Isabella picked Michael up with the skill of someone who had done it hundreds of times before, gently rocking him as she walked through the empty room of the apartment, on the 3rd floor of the building. The building had been abandoned by the construction company 2 years ago when the company went bankrupt, leaving only concrete structures and interrupted dreams. For Isabella and her brothers, however, that place had become a refuge. It was there they had been hiding since their mother, Constance, had gone to a place from which she would not return. Her last words echoed in Isabella's mind like a sacred promise they would never be separated no matter what happened. Isabella knew every sound in the building. She knew when someone was coming up the stairs by the echoes that reverberated through the corridors. She knew the noise of rats in the walls and the constant dripping from a broken pipe on the floor above. Most importantly, she knew when it was safe to go out for food, and when it was better to remain invisible. That morning, as Michael finally calmed down in her arms, she mentally calculated what remained of their provisions. Half a package of cookies she had found in the trash of a bakery the previous week, a little powdered milk that a kind lady had given her 2 days before, and water that she collected from the rain in buckets scattered on the roof. It wouldn't be enough for much longer. She put Michael back next to Ryan and walked to the window. Down below, the city of Chicago was awakening with its usual symphony of engines, horns, and hurried voices. People were leaving their safe homes, driving shiny cars, walking with certain destinations. Isabella observed that world like someone watching a movie they weren't part of. On the other side of the city, in an apartment on the 30th floor of a commercial building on Michigan Avenue, Richard Adams adjusted his Italian tie in front of the mirror. At 42, he was a meticulously organized man. Every detail of his appearance reflected the control he exercised over his life. Perfectly aligned hair, tailored suit, shoes that cost more than many families spent in a month. Richard was a managing partner of Adams & Associates, one of the largest construction companies in the country. His office occupied 2 entire floors of a building in the most upscale area of the city, and his schedule was always full of meetings with investors, architects, and politicians. That morning, however, a specific concern dominated his thoughts. The Greenview residential project, his most ambitious undertaking, had been stalled for months. The 40-story building, budgeted at $200 million, should have been inaugurated the previous year. However, the presence of families in vulnerable situations in abandoned buildings around the site was creating legal complications that delayed the schedule. International investors were beginning to question the deadlines. The competition was watching his every move, waiting for any sign of weakness to advance on the market that Richard had dominated for 2 decades. That morning, he would have to make decisions that would define not only the future of the project, but his reputation in the sector. Richard knew no hesitation when it came to business. For him, obstacles existed to be removed, contracts to be fulfilled, and profits to be maximized. The issue of families in abandoned buildings was just another technical problem that his legal team should solve efficiently. He picked up the keys to his BMW and went down to the garage. The journey to the office would take 20 minutes in the morning traffic, enough time to mentally review the arguments he would present at the meeting with investors. He would need to convince them that the obstacles were temporary and that the projected profits would be achieved as planned. As he drove through the busy avenues, Richard had no idea that at that same moment, a few miles away, an 11-year-old girl was preparing to go out into the streets in search of food to keep two babies alive, who depended entirely on her courage and determination. Isabella had developed a precise routine for her outings. She would wake before dawn, when the streets were still empty and the chances of being seen were lower. She would leave the twins sleeping in the most protected corner of the apartment, covered with all the blankets she owned. Before leaving, she would whisper a silent prayer, asking for protection and promising to return soon. That morning, she descended the stairs with light steps, avoiding the steps that creaked. On the ground floor, she peered cautiously before going out. The street was almost deserted, with only a few workers walking hurriedly toward the bus stop. Isabella knew the neighborhood well. She knew where the bakery dumpsters were, which merchants occasionally offered her help, and most importantly, she knew how to go unnoticed. She walked 3 blocks until she reached Mr. Joe's bakery. He was an elderly man who, on the few times he had seen her, showed compassion without asking invasive questions. Isabella knew he arrived early to prepare the day's bread, and sometimes there was leftover food that wouldn't be sold. She carefully approached the back door of the bakery. Mr. Joe was there as expected, taking bread out of the oven. When he saw her, his face lit up with a kind but concerned smile. "Girl, are you okay? It's been days since I've seen you around here," he asked, wiping his hands on his apron. "I am, Mr. Joe. The babies are growing and needing more food," Isabella replied with the sincerity that she had learned to be her greatest ally. The baker shook his head, clearly touched by the situation. He took a bag and began to fill it with bread, cookies, and some products that were close to their expiration date. "Take this, child, and be careful, okay? If you need anything, you know where to find me." Isabella thanked him with eyes shining with gratitude and left quickly. She knew she couldn't spend too much time away from the twins. On the way back, she allowed herself a moment of relief. She would have enough food for a few more days. Meanwhile, Richard arrived at his office and was greeted by his assistant Claire with an agenda full of urgent appointments. The meeting with investors was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and he needed to review all the project documents before that. "Claire, cancel my lunch today. I'll need extra time to resolve the issue of the abandoned buildings near the construction site," he said, heading to his office. "I've already spoken with the legal department, Mr. Adams. They said the eviction orders can be issued this week, if you authorize it." Richard nodded without hesitation. For him, it was a purely administrative matter. Families in irregular situations needed to be relocated by the competent authorities, and his construction needed to follow the established schedule. There was no room for sentimentality in business decisions. "Do that. I want everything resolved as quickly as possible." Isabella was climbing the stairs of the abandoned building with the bag of food when she heard a different noise coming from her apartment. It was a low but constant moan that made her heart race with concern. She ran up the last few steps and found Ryan awake, crying in a way she had never heard before. She immediately picked him up and noticed that his temperature was very high. The baby was breathing with difficulty and his skin was pale. Michael was also awake but calm, watching his brother with his big, curious eyes. Isabella felt a wave of panic take over her body. She didn't know what to do when the babies got really sick. She tried to cool Ryan with a damp cloth, offered him water, rocked him gently, but nothing seemed to work. The baby continued to moan, and his breathing became increasingly difficult. For the first time since she had taken responsibility for caring for her brothers, Isabella felt that she might not be enough. The morning advanced, and the situation didn't improve. Isabella made a decision she knew was risky. She would need to go out into the streets in search of help, even at the risk of being seen by the authorities. She couldn't leave Ryan in that state. She wrapped the 2 babies in blankets, took the small backpack where she kept the few documents she had, and went down the stairs for the last time. She didn't know it yet, but that exit would forever change the fate of the 3 siblings. The streets of Chicago were bustling with the typical movement of a Tuesday morning when Isabella left the abandoned building carrying the 2 babies. Ryan continued to moan softly, his labored breathing contrasting with the silence of Michael. who seemed to sense the tension of his older sister. The weight of the two in her thin arms made her walk more slowly than usual, but the determination in her eyes didn't waver. Isabella didn't have a specific destination in mind. She only knew that she needed to find someone who could help Ryan. Maybe Mr. Joe from the bakery knew someone, or maybe she would find one of the kind ladies who occasionally offered her food, anyone who could guide her on what to do with such a sick baby. As she walked along the sidewalk trying to stay in the shadows of the buildings, Isabella didn't notice that she was being observed from afar by neighbors who were beginning to speculate about that girl who appeared sporadically in the area. Some whispered among themselves, concerned, but no one approached to offer direct help. On the other side of the city, Richard was finishing his meeting with international investors at the Adams and Associates office. The conversation had been tense, with partners showing growing impatience with the delays of the Greenview residential project. Richard had managed to temporarily reassure them, promising that all legal issues would be resolved in the coming weeks. "Mr. Adams, the eviction documents are ready for your signature," Claire informed him, as soon as the investors left the meeting room. "The legal department has assured that the process will be quick and efficient." Richard took the papers and quickly analyzed them. They were technical, cold documents that transformed people into process numbers. For him, they represented only the removal of obstacles that impeded the progress of his business. He signed, without hesitation, authorizing the measures that would evict dozens of families from the abandoned buildings. "Perfect. I want a complete report by the end of the week on the progress of the removals, and schedule a meeting with the architecture team to review the construction schedule." Richard picked up his keys and headed to the parking lot. He had an important meeting at a construction site in the south side of the city, where another of his developments was being finalized. The journey would take about 40 minutes in the heavy traffic, but he would use the time to make some important calls. He left the parking lot in his silver BMW, navigating the congested streets with the skill of someone who knew the city's paths well. Richard was used to that routine. Meetings, signatures, decisions that moved millions of dollars, all executed with the precision of a well-oiled machine. While driving down Michigan Avenue, his phone rang. It was Marcus, his minority partner, with news about the competition. "Richard, I just found out that Santana Construction is eyeing the land next to our project. If they get that area, they can create direct competition that will affect our sales prices. That can't happen. Schedule an urgent meeting with the owners of that land. We'll make them an offer they can't refuse," Richard replied, already mentally calculating the values involved. The conversation lasted another 15 minutes, discussing strategies and deadlines. When he finally hung up, Richard realized he had missed the exit he normally took to reach the construction site. He decided to follow an alternative route, crossing a neighborhood he rarely visited. It was at that moment, while stopping at a traffic light, that he saw a scene that made something inside him move in a completely unexpected way. A thin girl with dark hair and worn clothes was slowly crossing the street, carrying two babies in her arms. Even from a distance, Richard could see the effort she was making to keep the little ones safe as she walked. There was something in her posture, a determination mixed with desperation, that caught his attention in a way he couldn't explain. The light turned green, but Richard didn't accelerate immediately. He continued to observe the girl, who had now stopped on the sidewalk and seemed lost, looking in all directions as if searching for something or someone. One of the babies was crying, and she was gently rocking him, whispering words that he couldn't hear. Behind him, other drivers began to honk impatiently. Richard finally accelerated, but continued to observe through the rearview mirror until he lost sight of the girl. Something in that image disturbed him deeply, although he couldn't identify exactly what. Isabella had stopped at the corner because Ryan was getting worse. His breathing had become more difficult, and she could feel the heat of the fever through the blanket. Michael was whimpering softly, probably hungry, but she had no way to feed him at that moment. She needed to find help for Ryan urgently. She looked around, searching for someone who might help her. The street was busy, but people passed by hurriedly, absorbed in their own concerns. Isabella knew from experience that most people preferred not to get involved with situations like hers. It was then that she saw a pharmacy across the street, Maybe the pharmacist could guide her on what to do with Ryan. She waited for the light to change and carefully crossed, protecting the babies from the movement of pedestrians. Inside the pharmacy, the pharmacist, a middle-aged man named Albert, served her kindly, but soon became concerned when he saw Ryan's condition. "Girl, this baby needs urgent medical attention. You can't take care of a fever like this alone. Where are your parents?" Isabella felt her heart racing. It was the question she feared most, the one that could lead to the siblings being separated. They can't come now. I just need to know what to give him to make him better," she replied, trying to sound convincing. Albert shook his head, clearly worried. "Child, this baby needs to go to a hospital. I can call an ambulance for you." "No, please don't call anyone. We'll be fine," said Isabella, backing toward the door. But Albert had already realized that something was very wrong with the situation. A girl so young taking care of 2 sick babies alone wasn't normal. As Isabella hurriedly left the pharmacy, he picked up the phone, torn between the desire to help and the need to alert the authorities. Isabella walked a few more blocks, but Ryan was getting worse and worse. Her strength was also beginning to run out. The weight of the 2 babies, the constant worry and the lack of a proper meal for more than 24 hours were taking their toll. It was when she had to stop again, this time leaning on a lamppost to avoid falling, that she saw the silver car approaching slowly. The driver was clearly looking for her, driving slowly and looking in her direction. Isabella prepared to run, but her legs were shaking with exhaustion. Ryan moaned louder, and she realized she had no more strength to flee. When the car stopped beside her and the window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit who seemed as out of place in that neighborhood as she would feel in a shopping mall, Isabella was surprised to hear a gentle voice. "Do you need help? I can take you to the hospital." Richard didn't know how to explain why he had come back to look for the girl. After seeing her crossing the street with the babies, he couldn't concentrate on the work meeting. He cancelled the appointment and returned to where he had seen her, driving through nearby streets until he found her again. Isabella observed him for a moment that seemed eternal. She had learned to distrust unknown adults, but Ryan desperately needed medical help. She made the most difficult decision of her young life. "Please, he's very sick," she said, her voice breaking for the first time since she had taken responsibility for her brothers. Richard got out of the car and helped Isabella accommodate the babies in the back seat. As he drove toward the nearest hospital, he asked careful questions about Ryan's condition, trying to keep the girl calm. He had no idea that this impulsive act of compassion would completely change the course of his meticulously planned life. During the journey, Isabella observed the man through the rear-view mirror. He seemed rich, important, and she couldn't understand why someone like him would stop to help children like them. Perhaps there were good people in the world, people who would help without asking for anything in return. For the first time in months, Isabella allowed herself to feel a small spark of hope. St. Catherine's Hospital was bustling with the typical activity of a busy morning when Richard arrived carrying Ryan in his arms, followed closely by Isabella, who was holding Michael. The rush of the corridors, the smell of disinfectant and the sounds of medical equipment created an atmosphere of urgency that made Isabella's heart beat faster. At the pediatric emergency reception, Nurse Caroline looked with strangeness at that unusual group, an elegant man in a suit and a girl in worn clothes both carrying babies. Richard approached the counter with the natural authority of someone who was accustomed to being attended to immediately. "I need urgent care for this baby. He has a high fever and breathing difficulties," said Richard, his voice carrying the genuine concern he felt. Caroline picked up a clipboard with forms and began to ask routine questions. "What is the child's name? What is your relationship to him? Where are the documents?" Richard looked at Isabella, expecting her to answer, but the girl remained silent, hugging Michael more tightly. She was clearly frightened by all that formal situation, with questions and procedures she didn't understand. "He's my son," Richard replied impulsively, surprising himself with the lie that came out so naturally. "His name is Ryan." Caroline noted the information but continued with the standard questions. Date of birth, residential address, health insurance. Richard improvised the answers, providing his own address and corporate health insurance information. With each question, he felt more involved in a situation that was rapidly spinning out of his control. At the same time, he saw Ryan becoming increasingly debilitated in Isabella's arms and knew there was no time for hesitation. With the basic information collected, Caroline directed them to triage. The on-duty pediatrician, Dr. Helen Miller, an experienced woman with grey hair and an attentive gaze, examined Ryan immediately. Her expression became serious as she observed the baby's condition. "He has a severe respiratory infection. We'll need to admit him for observation and intravenous treatment. How long has he been like this?" Richard looked at Isabella, who whispered hesitantly, "Since yesterday morning. He woke up like this." Dr. Helen continued the examination, but her experienced eyes had already noticed details that raised questions. Ryan was clearly malnourished, his clothes were inadequate for his age, and there were signs that he wasn't receiving regular pediatric care. Additionally, the dynamic between the well-dressed man, the girl, and the babies seemed strange. "We're going to take him to pediatrics right now. Dad, I need you to sign the hospitalization terms and authorization for treatment," she said, handing more forms to Richard. While Richard signed the documents, trying to maintain his composure, Isabella remained beside the bed where Ryan had been placed. For the first time in months, she wasn't the only one responsible for her brother's well-being. There was equipment monitoring his vital signs, experienced nurses caring for him, and doctors who knew exactly what to do. It was an immense relief, but also terrifying. Michael began to cry, probably hungry. Isabella rocked him gently, but the crying caught the attention of Dr. Helen, who approached to examine him as well. "And this one? Is he your son too?" she asked, addressing Richard. "Yes, they're twins," he replied, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the lies he was creating. Dr. Helen quickly examined Michael and found that he also showed signs of malnutrition, although he was in better condition than Ryan. Her trained eyes caught more concerning details. The girl seemed to know the baby's needs very well, reacting to each sound and movement they made, while the supposed father seemed lost and unprepared. "Doctor, I need to speak with you in private," she said, indicating a more reserved corner of the infirmary. Richard followed her, feeling the weight of the doctor's inquisitive gaze. He knew something was wrong, but had no idea how to explain the situation without complicating things even more. "Sir, how long has it been since you took these children to the pediatrician? They show clear signs of inadequate care and malnutrition." Richard felt cold sweat run down his back. He had no answer to that question, because there was no answer he could give without revealing the truth. "We've been going through some financial difficulties recently," he improvised. "We haven't been able to maintain regular care." Dr. Helen studied him carefully. There was something in his posture, in the way he avoided eye contact, that didn't match his explanations. Moreover, his clothes and accessories clearly indicated that he wasn't experiencing financial difficulties. Meanwhile, in the infirmary, Isabella was talking softly with a nursing assistant named Julie, who had noticed how the girl demonstrated a deep knowledge of the baby's habits and needs. "You take very good care of them," Julie said gently. "How old are you?" 11, Isabella replied, without thinking twice. Julie felt a shiver of concern. An 11-year-old girl shouldn't have that level of responsibility with babies. Something was very wrong with that family. "And your mother? Where is she?" Isabella froze. It was the question she feared most, the one that always made her remember the promise she had made. "She's not here," she replied evasively. Julie decided not to pressure her more at that moment, but made a mental note to talk with Dr. Helen about her observations. When Richard returned from the hallway, he found an even more complicated situation. The hospital social worker, Martha Sanders, had arrived to conduct the routine assessment that was protocol in cases of hospitalization of children with signs of neglect. Martha was a 40-year-old woman with 2 decades of experience working with families in vulnerable situations. Her trained eyes immediately caught the inconsistencies in that situation. She approached Richard with professionalism, but also with a healthy dose of skepticism. "Good morning, sir. I'm Martha Sanders, the hospital social worker. I need to ask some questions about these children's family situation." Richard felt the ground moving beneath his feet. He knew he had reached the point where it would be impossible to maintain the lies he had impulsively created. Martha's questions were direct and specific. She wanted to know about the children's routine, about previous medical care, about the mother who wasn't present, about details that Richard simply had no way of knowing. It was when Martha addressed Isabella directly that the situation became untenable. "Sweetheart, what is your mother's full name?" "Constance Maria Stevens," Isabella replied automatically. "And where is she now?" Isabella looked at Richard, then at Martha, and finally shook her head negatively. She could no longer maintain the lie that she hadn't created. "No, he's not my father. He just brought us here because Ryan was sick," she confessed, her voice almost inaudible. Martha took a deep breath. It was exactly what she suspected, but hearing the confirmation still impacted her. She looked at Richard, who was visibly uncomfortable, and then turned her attention back to Isabella. "And where are your real parents, dear?" "My mother, Hamel, she's been gone for a few months. We don't have anyone else," said Isabella, the words coming out with difficulty. "I take care of my brothers by myself." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The reality of those children's situation hit him with full force. They weren't just sick children who needed medical help. They were orphans living in conditions he couldn't even imagine. Martha stood up and signaled for Richard to accompany her again for a private conversation. This time there was no more room for lies or improvisations. "Sir, I need you to explain exactly how you met these children and why you decided to bring them to the hospital pretending to be their father." Richard told the truth. How he had seen Isabella on the street carrying the babies, how he had noticed that Ryan was sick, how he had offered help and decided to bring them to the hospital. He explained that he had lied about being the father only to ensure they would receive immediate care. Martha listened in silence, making occasional notes. When he finished, she sighed heavily. "Sir, I understand your intention to help, but you need to understand the gravity of the situation. These children are unaccompanied minors, living without adequate adult supervision. By law, I need to notify Child Protective Services." Martha's words echoed in Richard's mind like a sentence. He looked through the infirmary glass and saw Isabella, sitting next to Ryan's bed, holding Michael in her lap. There was something in her posture, in the way she protected her brothers, even in that difficult situation, that touched him deeply. "What will happen to them?" he asked. Martha explained the protocol. The children would be placed under state custody temporarily. Ryan would stay in the hospital until he fully recovered, then would be sent to a foster home. Michael would probably go to another institution, since there were few families willing to adopt 2 babies at the same time. Isabella, being 11 years old, would be sent to a shelter for older children. "They'll be separated?" The question left Richard's mouth before he could contain himself. "Unfortunately, it's very likely. It's rare to find families willing to take in 3 children simultaneously, especially with 2 being babies." Richard felt something break inside him. The idea of those 3 children being separated after all they had already been through together seemed profoundly wrong. "Is there any alternative? Some way to keep them together?" Martha studied him carefully. She had seen many people offer impulsive help in emotional moments, only to regret it later when they understood the real dimension of the commitment. "Well, there is the possibility of temporary guardianship, but that would require a complete evaluation of the candidate, background check, financial stability, emotional readiness to care for 3 children in a trauma situation. I would like to be considered for that temporary guardianship," said Richard, surprising himself with the firmness of his response. Martha raised her eyebrows. "Sir, this is a very serious decision. Temporary guardianship is not occasional charity. It's a legal commitment that can last months or even years, depending on the situation." "I understand that, but I can't simply walk away knowing they're going to be separated." At that moment, Isabella appeared at the door, clearly having heard part of the conversation. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a fierce determination in her expression. "Please don't separate us. I promised my mother that we would always take care of each other. I can take care of my brothers. I know how to do it. Martha knelt again beside Isabella. Dear, you've been doing an amazing job taking care of your brothers, but you're still a child. You deserve to have someone taking care of you too. Isabella looked at Richard, trying to understand why a stranger would be willing to help them that way. During the months she had cared for her brothers alone, she had learned to distrust the kindness of adults. But there was something genuine in that man's gaze. If you really want to help us, can we stay together? She asked, her voice carrying a fragile hope. Richard knelt at her height. I can't promise anything yet, but I'll do everything in my power to make sure you aren't separated. Martha observed the interaction between them and felt there was something special happening there. In her 20 years of career, she had seen many difficult situations, but she had also witnessed moments of genuine human connection that changed lives forever. Very well, she finally said. I'll initiate the evaluation process for temporary guardianship, but I need to make it clear that it will be a rigorous process. Meanwhile, the children will remain under the hospital's custody until we have a decision. Richard nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he had proposed to do. His meticulously organized life, his business plans, his routine as a successful bachelor, all of this was about to be completely transformed. How long does this process take? He asked. Normally a few weeks, but given Ryan's health condition and the urgency of the situation, I can try to accelerate it. You would have at most 1 week to present all the necessary documentation. 1 week. Richard mentally calculated everything he would need to cancel, reorganize, and prepare. Important meetings, business trips, commitments that moved millions of dollars. For a moment, the magnitude of the decision haunted him. It was then that he heard Ryan crying softly in the infirmary and saw Isabella rising immediately to console him, even though she was clearly exhausted. At that instant, all his doubts dissipated. 1 week is enough, he said with determination. We'll make this work. He was beginning to understand that he didn't know the answers to those questions. He started to realize that he wasn't who he claimed to be, and that the whole situation was becoming much more complicated than she had imagined. She's gone, whispered Isabella, tears beginning to run down her cheeks. Martha felt her heart tighten. She had dealt with many similar cases throughout her career and knew how to recognize the signs. She gently approached Isabella and knelt beside her. Love, tell me the truth. Is this man your father? Isabella looked at Richard, realizing for the first time that he didn't know the answers to those questions. The next 7 days passed like a hurricane in Richard Adams's life. For the first time in his career, he had to cancel important meetings, postpone business decisions, and completely reorganize his schedule. His bachelor apartment, previously a sanctuary of order and silence, needed to be transformed into a suitable home for 3 children. Martha Sanders had been clear about the requirements: complete income documentation, criminal background check, psychological evaluation, preparation of the home environment, and most importantly, demonstration that he was genuinely prepared for the responsibility he was assuming. At the hospital, Ryan showed signs of gradual improvement. The respiratory infection was being controlled with antibiotics, and his color had returned to normal. Isabella spent her days by his side, helping the nurses and learning about medical care she had never imagined would be necessary. Michael, who was being kept in the hospital for nutritional observation, was beginning to gain weight with proper feeding. Richard visited the children every morning before going to work and every evening after his workday. During these visits, he began to get to know each of them better. Isabella was intelligent and observant, but also extremely protective and cautious. There was a premature maturity in her gestures, the result of the months when she had been solely responsible for her brothers. During one of these evening visits, while helping Isabella give a bottle to Michael, Richard began to understand the magnitude of the transformation he would undergo. "Do you really want to do this?" Isabella suddenly asked, her eyes carefully studying his face. "Taking care of the 3 of us won't be easy. Ryan will still need medicine for weeks. Michael wakes up many times during the night and I sometimes have nightmares. Richard stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. Isabella, since I met you, my life has changed in a way I didn't know was possible. Before, I thought only about work, about profits, about achieving more and more. Now, for the first time, I feel like I'm doing something truly important. But you're rich, you have a good life. Why do you want to complicate things with us? Her question made him reflect on motivations that he himself didn't completely understand. I don't know how to explain it properly, Isabella, but when I think about you being separated, I feel that something very wrong is happening. You belong to each other, and if I can help maintain that, then any complication is worth it. Isabella nodded slowly. She had learned to recognize sincerity, and there was something in Richard's voice that reassured her. Meanwhile, at the Adams & Associates office, Richard's frequent absence was generating speculation and concerns. Marcus, his partner, had tried several times to schedule urgent meetings about the Greenview residential project, but Richard continued to postpone or cancel appointments. On a particularly tense afternoon, Marcus decided to confront him directly. "Richard, I need to know what's going on. The investors are beginning to question your dedication to the project. You cancelled 3 meetings this week, didn't return important calls, and I heard you stopped the eviction orders for the abandoned buildings." Richard was in his office, reviewing the documents that Martha had requested for the guardianship process. He looked at Marcus and realized the time had come to be honest, at least partially. "Marcus, I'm going through a personal situation that requires my full attention in the coming weeks. As for the eviction orders, I decided to suspend them temporarily while we explore more humane alternatives." "More humane alternatives?" Marcus looked at him as if he didn't recognize him. "Richard, you're talking as if you were an NGO, not a company that has commitments to investors. What's happening to you?" Richard put away the documents and stood up. "Maybe I'm beginning to understand that not everything in life comes down to profits and contracts." Marcus remained silent for a moment, clearly disturbed by the change he perceived in his partner. "Richard, if you're going through some kind of personal crisis, we can talk about it, but you can't allow it to affect our business." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Claire, who brought news that made Richard's heart race. "Mr. Adams, Martha Sanders from St. Catherine's Hospital called. She needs to speak with you urgently about the home evaluation that will be conducted tomorrow." Richard immediately picked up his keys. "Marcus, we'll continue this conversation later. Now I have something more important to resolve." The home. The evaluation was a thorough and sometimes embarrassing process. Martha arrived at Richard's apartment, accompanied by a colleague, Dr. Fernanda Lopez, a psychologist specializing in adoption and guardianship. They inspected each room, asked questions about routines, verified the safety of the environment, and observed how Richard had prepared the space for the children. Richard had transformed his office into a room for Isabella, set up an improvised nursery in his master bedroom for the twins, and had stocked diapers, bottles, clothes, and toys in quantities that demonstrated his seriousness about the commitment. "It's impressive how you've prepared in such a short time," commented Dr. Fernanda. "But I'm concerned about the fact that you have no previous experience with children. Taking care of 3 at once, especially considering that 2 are babies and 1 has gone through significant trauma, will be extremely challenging." "I understand your concerns," Richard replied. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to learn and to seek all the professional help necessary. I've already contacted a pediatrician for regular follow-up and a child psychologist to help Isabella process her experiences." The evaluators asked more questions about his motivation, his long-term plans, how he intended to reconcile work with family responsibilities, and most importantly, how he would react if the children presented behavioral or health problems. During the evaluation, Richard received a call from Marcus that he couldn't ignore. Santana Construction had made an aggressive offer to take over the Greenview residential project, taking advantage of the delays and instability generated by Richard's absence. "I need your answer by tomorrow morning," Marcus said on the phone. "If we don't make a decision now, we could lose everything." Richard looked at the evaluators, who had clearly heard the conversation, and then at the room he had prepared for Isabella, with a new bed, study desk, and a bookshelf full of books. He had bought, "Marcus, make whatever decision you think is best. At this moment, I have more important priorities." After the evaluators left, Richard remained alone in his transformed apartment, reflecting on how his life had changed drastically in just 1 week. He had invested years building his career, accumulating wealth and prestige, but no professional achievement had given him the sense of purpose he felt now. The next day, Martha called with the result of the evaluation. Her voice was careful, professional, but there was a note of satisfaction that Richard could detect. "Mr. Adams, after analyzing all aspects of your request, we've decided to approve the temporary guardianship. However, there will be a supervised adaptation period of 3 months, with regular visits and psychological follow-up for all the children." Richard felt his legs tremble with relief. "Will they be able to leave the hospital today?" "Ryan received medical clearance yesterday, so yes, they can all go home today. But remember, Mr. Adams, this is just the first step. Temporary guardianship can become permanent, but that will depend on how everyone adapts in the coming months." When Richard arrived at the hospital to pick up the children, he found Isabella carefully arranging the few clothes they owned in a plastic bag. Ryan was in a nurse's arms, playing with a rattle, visibly healthier. Michael was placidly sleeping in his portable crib. Nurse Julie, who had accompanied the three throughout their hospitalization, approached Richard with teary eyes. "Sir, these children are very special. Isabella took care of her brothers with a love that I rarely see even in adults. They need someone who understands that." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility, but also an unwavering determination. "I'll take good care of them, I promise." Isabella approached timidly. "Are we really going to live with you?" "Yes, Isabella. From today on, you have a real home." She held his hand for the first time, a small but deeply significant gesture. Ryan gurgled happily when Richard picked him up, and Michael continued to sleep peacefully when he was transferred to the car. During the journey home, Richard looked in the rearview mirror and saw Isabella attentively observing the buildings they passed, as if memorizing the path to her new life. He didn't imagine that the biggest challenges were yet to come, but for the first time in many years, he felt he was exactly where he should be. The first night at home was a reality shock for Richard. Michael woke up crying at 2 in the morning, then at 4, and again at 6. Between one bottle and another, Ryan also woke up with colic, needing to be calmed with walks around the apartment. Isabella, despite her visible exhaustion, automatically got up at each cry, helping Richard understand what each baby needed. During the first few days, Richard discovered that taking care of 3 children was much more challenging than any business project he had ever managed. There were no scheduled meetings for the baby's needs, no predictable timelines for their demands. Isabella became his guide in this new world, teaching him the subtle signs that indicated hunger, sleep, discomfort, or the need for attention. "She knows when Ryan will have colic just by looking at him," observed Richard one morning, as he watched Isabella prepare Michael's bottle with surgical precision. "I took care of them alone for months," she replied. "Simply. I learned to notice everything." Richard realized that Isabella, at 11 years old, had knowledge about childcare that he, at 42, had never imagined existed. She knew how to make the babies stop crying with specific types of caresses, knew their food preferences, and even their natural sleep schedules. However, not everything was harmony. Isabella showed moments of resistance and distrust, especially when Richard tried to establish routines or rules. She had learned to survive by being responsible for all decisions, and accepting an adult's authority required a painful adaptation process. The first major conflict happened when Martha made her first follow-up visit. She had noticed that Isabella was still not attending school, which was mandatory for children her age. "Mr. Adams, it's essential that Isabella be enrolled immediately. Education is a basic right, and school absence can be considered neglect." Richard immediately agreed and tried to explain the situation to Isabella, but her reaction was unexpected and intense. "I won't leave my brothers. What if something happens to them while I'm gone? What if you get tired of taking care of them and decide to send them away?" Isabella's words revealed the deep fear that tormented her, the fear of abandonment. For months, she had been the only protection for her brothers, and the idea of leaving them in someone else's care, even for a few hours, terrified her. Richard knelt at her height, trying to find the right words. "Isabella, I understand your fear, but you need to trust me. Your brothers will be safe, and you need to study to have a better future." "You don't understand anything," she shouted, surprising everyone with the intensity of her emotional outburst. "You think you can come here and change everything, but you don't know what we've been through. You don't know what it's like to be afraid to sleep because you don't know if there will be food the next day." Isabella's outburst echoed through the apartment, followed by a heavy silence. Ryan and Michael, sensitive to the tension in the environment, began to cry simultaneously. Isabella ran to console them, hugging them protectively. Martha observed the entire scene with professional attention. It was exactly the type of reaction she expected from a child who had experienced significant trauma. She carefully approached Isabella. "Dear, you've done an amazing job taking care of your brothers. No one is going to take that away from you, but now you have help, and that means you can be a child too." Isabella looked at Martha with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to be just a child. It's been a long time since I've been responsible for them." That painful confession made Richard understand dimensions of Isabella's experience that he hadn't considered before. She wasn't simply resisting change. She was fighting against the fear of losing her identity as her brother's protector. The solution came gradually. Richard hired an experienced nanny, Mrs. Carmen, a 60-year-old woman who had raised 7 children and various grandchildren. Instead of simply imposing her presence, Richard allowed Isabella to get to know her gradually, teach her the specific habits of the twins, and feel included in the care process. Mrs. Carmen proved to be a perfect choice. Patient and loving, she didn't try to replace Isabella but rather support her. During the first few weeks, Isabella went to school only part-time, returning home at lunchtime to check that everything was fine with her brothers. At the same time, professional pressures on Richard intensified dramatically. Marcus had temporarily taken over decisions about the Greenview residential project, but the situation was rapidly deteriorating. International investors, frustrated with the delays and lack of clear communication, were considering withdrawing their resources. In a tense meeting at the office, Marcus presented an ultimatum. "Richard, I need to know if you're still committed to this company. If you've decided you want to be a full-time father, I respect that, but I can't continue holding things together alone." The question hit Richard like a punch. He had built Adams & Associates over 15 years, transforming it into one of the most respected construction companies in the country. Abandoning everything seemed unthinkable, but at the same time he couldn't imagine leaving the children at that crucial moment of adaptation. "I need more time to find a balance," he replied, but he knew time was running out. The crisis reached its peak when, on a particularly difficult night, Richard was distracted during an emergency call with investors and forgot to give Ryan his antibiotic. The baby had developed a new infection, milder than the previous one, but still requiring rigorous medication. Ryan began to have a high fever during the night. When Richard realized the error, he panicked. Isabella woke up with her brothers, desperate crying, and immediately identified the symptoms. "You forgot the medicine," she said, not as an accusation, but as a painful observation. "He's going to get sick again." The guilt Richard felt was devastating. He picked Ryan up and immediately headed to the hospital, followed by Isabella with Michael in her arms and Mrs. Carmen, who had been urgently called. In the emergency room, Dr. Helen, who already knew the family's history, examined Ryan and confirmed that the infection had returned, although to a lesser degree. With proper medication, he would recover quickly, but the incident served as a severe warning. "Mr. Adams, taking care of children requires total attention. "There's no room for distractions when it comes to their health," said the doctor, her voice laden with professional concern. During the hours they spent at the hospital waiting for the medication to take effect, Richard reflected deeply on his priorities. Isabella remained beside Ryan, humming softly to calm him, once again demonstrating the maturity and care she had developed. It was at that moment that Richard made a decision that would definitively change the course of his life. He took the phone and called Marcus. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about my participation in the company. I've decided to step back from daily operations. I want you to take over as CEO." The conversation was long and difficult. Marcus tried to argue, offered intermediate solutions, suggested temporary leaves, but Richard was unyielding. He had found something more important than any business success. When they returned home the next day, with Ryan recovered and medicated, Isabella approached Richard with a serious expression. "Are you going to abandon us because this is too difficult?" Richard picked her up, something she was finally allowing him to do. "Isabella, I made a mistake yesterday and it taught me something very important. You are my priority now. I won't abandon you, but I'll need to make some changes to be the best caregiver possible." In the following days, Richard began to implement profound changes in his life. He drastically reduced his business commitments, established more structured routines at home, and most importantly, began to seek professional help to deal with the emotional challenges the children faced. The child psychologist, Dr. Beatrice Oliver, began working with Isabella to help her process the trauma of losing her mother and the transition to a new life. During the sessions, it became clear that the girl carried an immense guilt for not being able to save her mother from her difficulties. "Isabella, you were just a child. It wasn't your responsibility to save your mother. You did everything you could, and it was amazing how you took care of your brothers." The therapy sessions were fundamental for Isabella to begin accepting that she could trust Richard and share the responsibilities she had carried alone for so long. Gradually, she began to demonstrate behaviors more typical of an 11-year-old child, playing, laughing, and even making occasional mischief. The first time Richard heard Isabella laugh genuinely was during a Sunday afternoon when she was playing hide-and-seek with the twins in the apartment. The sound of her laughter echoed through the rooms like music, and he realized that all the difficult decisions he had made were worth it at that moment. However, other challenges were still approaching. The media had discovered the guardianship story and begun to speculate about Richard's motives. Some publications suggested it was a marketing ploy to improve his company's image. Others questioned his qualifications to care for traumatized children. When photographs of the family began to appear in newspapers and gossip websites, Isabella was frightened and confused. Richard realized he would need to protect her not only from the practical difficulties of life, but also from the unwanted public exposure that his social position brought. 6 months had passed since Richard brought the 3 children home, and life had found its own rhythm, made of busy mornings, afternoons of discoveries, and evenings of stories before bedtime. The apartment, previously silent and immaculate, now vibrated with sounds of laughter, crying, playing, and all the sweet mess that 3 small children can create. Isabella was flourishing at school, her natural intelligence, finally nurtured, with proper education, made her stand out in all subjects. She had made friends for the first time in her life, children who didn't know her difficult history and who simply saw her as a fun and intelligent classmate. During parent-teacher meetings, teachers praised not only her academic performance, but also her maturity and ability to help classmates with difficulties. Ryan and Michael had completely transformed. The thin, fragile babies that Richard had met at the hospital were now healthy, curious, and playful children. Ryan had developed a passion for toy cars and spent hours pushing his toys around the house, making engine noises that echoed through the corridors. Michael, quieter by nature, loved colorful books and music, swaying his little body whenever he heard his favorite songs. Mrs. Carmen had become much more than a nanny. She was a chosen grandmother, a maternal figure who perfectly complemented the care that Richard offered. She had brought to that home the flavor of feminine affection, teaching Isabella to cook traditional American dishes, and telling stories that made the twins laugh out loud. However, the stability of that new life was about to be tested in a way none of them expected. Martha Sanders had scheduled the final evaluation visit, the one that would determine if the temporary guardianship would become permanent. It was a crucial moment because after 6 months the judicial system needed to make a permanent decision about the children's future. On the morning of the visit, Isabella was visibly nervous. Richard found her awake early, obsessively tidying the twins' room, checking that everything was perfect. "What if she decides we're not a real family?" Isabella asked, her voice laden with anxiety. "What if she says you're not our real father and that we have to leave?" Richard sat beside her on the boy's bed. "Isabella, look at me. We are a family. Maybe not in the traditional way, but we are, and no matter what happens today, that won't change. But what if?" "There is no what if," he said firmly, taking her hands. "I will fight for you until the end. I promise." When Martha arrived, accompanied by Dr. Fernanda and a representative from Child Protective Services, the house was in perfect harmony. Ryan and Michael were playing quietly in the living room. Isabella was helping Mrs. Carmen prepare lunch, and Richard was organizing some documents at the kitchen table. The evaluation lasted almost 3 hours. The professionals observed family interactions, asked individual questions to each family member, analyzed the children's development, and verified all aspects of the care provided. The most touching moment of the visit happened when Dr. Fernanda asked Ryan, now a 1.5 years old and already speaking some words, who Richard was to him. "Daddy," said the boy without hesitation, running into Richard's arms with a radiant smile. Michael, who still wasn't speaking clearly but understood much of what he heard, also approached Richard, making sounds that sounded like attempts to say, "Daddy." Isabella was questioned about her feelings regarding the current situation. "Before I was very afraid of everything," she replied with a maturity that impressed the evaluators. "Afraid that my brothers would get sick, afraid of not having food, afraid that someone would separate us. Now I still worry about them because I will always worry, but it's not fear anymore. It's affection. And I know that Richard, Dad, also worries about us in the same way." Martha made a point of also evaluating Richard's perspective on the challenges faced and his future expectations. "I won't lie and say it was easy," he replied honestly. "There were sleepless nights, moments of panic when I didn't know what to do, situations where I questioned whether I was prepared for so much responsibility. But with each passing day, I'm more certain that this is the best decision I've ever made in my life." "What are your long-term plans?" asked the Child Protective Services representative. Richard looked at the 3 children, who were playing together on the living room rug. "I want to give them everything they deserve. Quality education, health, security, but mainly I want them to grow up knowing they are unconditionally loved. Isabella has incredible academic potential, and I want to support her in all her dreams. The twins are still small, but they already show unique personalities, and I want to be present for every discovery, every achievement." The conversation was interrupted by an incident that, paradoxically, definitively sealed the evaluation in a positive way. Michael, trying to reach a toy, tripped and fell, hitting his forehead on the corner of a table. The child's strident cry made all the adults run to help, but it was Richard's reaction that caught the evaluators' attention. With precise and affectionate movements, he picked Michael up, checked the injury, applied ice while consoling him with soft words, and, at the same time, calmed Ryan, who had been startled by his brother's crying. Isabella also helped, bringing Michael's favorite teddy bear and humming softly to distract him. The perfect coordination between the 4, the naturalness with which each one knew their role in that moment of crisis, and especially the way Richard demonstrated experience and security in care, deeply impressed the evaluators. After the incident, when Michael was already calm and playing again, Martha addressed Richard with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Mr. Adams, in 20 years of career, I've followed hundreds of adoption and guardianship cases. I've rarely seen such a positive transformation as the one I've witnessed here." Richard's heart accelerated, but he remained silent, awaiting the verdict. "I'll recommend that the guardianship be converted to permanent adoption. These children have found not only a caregiver, but a true family." The emotion that filled the environment was indescribable. Isabella began to cry, but this time they were tears of relief and happiness. Richard hugged her tightly, while the twins, without completely understanding what was happening but feeling the joy in the air, laughed and clapped their hands. The legal adoption process would still take a few weeks to be finalized, but from that moment on, everyone knew they were officially united as a family. 3 months later, on a sunny spring morning, the entire family headed to the courthouse for the final adoption hearing. Richard wore his best suit, but had exchanged the sober tie for a colorful one that Isabella had chosen for him. She wore a new dress bought especially for the occasion, and the twins looked adorable in their matching outfits. Mrs. Carmen accompanied them, as did Martha, who had become much more than a social worker. She was now a family friend. Even some of Isabella's schoolmates came to the courthouse with their parents to support her in that special moment. The judge, Dr. Charles Mendoza, had followed the entire process and was visibly moved when pronouncing the sentence. "I rarely witness cases where the transformation is so evident and positive for all parties involved. Richard Adams, you have not only offered a home to these children, but found a family. Isabella, Ryan, and Michael, you have found not only a father, but someone who will love you unconditionally for the rest of your lives." When the gavel hit, the table officially finalizing the adoption, emotion overcame all those present. Richard hugged his 3 children, now officially his children, while tears of happiness ran down his face. 2 years later, life had settled into a happy and productive routine. Isabella, now 13, was one of the best students in her grade and had discovered a passion for medicine, inspired by the care she had learned to provide for her brothers. She dreamed of becoming a pediatrician to help other children as she had been helped. Ryan and Michael, now 3.5 years old, were active and healthy children who filled the house with energy and joy. Ryan had maintained his passion for cars and loved when Richard took him to see construction sites, where he was fascinated by the giant machines. Michael had developed a love for music and frequently improvised small concerts in the living room, using pots as drums. Richard had found a perfect balance between work and family. Although he was no longer the CEO of the company he founded, he maintained a participation as a consultant, which allowed him total flexibility to be present in his children's lives. He discovered that professional success was worth very little compared to the joy of seeing Isabella receive praise from her teacher, or hearing the twins shout, "Daddy's home," when he returned from work. On a special night, while putting the twins to bed, Richard found Isabella in her room studying for a science test. "Dad, can I ask you a question?" she said, naturally using the word that had taken months to come from her lips. "Of course, daughter. Always." "Do you regret changing your whole life because of us?" Richard stopped what he was doing and sat on the bed beside her. "Isabella, before I met you, I had a lot of money, a lot of success, but I had no life. You taught me what really matters. I don't regret anything. I only lament having taken 42 years to discover what it is to be truly happy." Isabella smiled and hugged him. "I love you too, Dad." That night, after all the children were asleep, Richard went out on the balcony of his apartment and looked at the illuminated city below. He thought of the man he was 2 years before, focused only on profits, distant from any deep emotional connection, living an empty existence disguised as success. Now his life was full of meaning. Each day brought small joys. Isabella's progress at school, the new words the twins learned, moments of spontaneous affection, laughter during dinner, stories before bedtime. He had discovered that love didn't need blood ties to be true and transformative. His family had been built with consciously made choices, day after day, to remain, care, protect, and love. It was a family forged in adversity, tempered by compassion, and strengthened by the daily decision to be together. Richard looked once more at the children's room, where 3 small human beings slept peacefully, knowing they were safe and loved. He smiled to himself, finally understanding that he had found the true wealth of life, a family built with love, dedication, and the courage to choose what really matters. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Richard, Isabella, Ryan, and Michael has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. This journey shows us that the most beautiful families are not always those formed by blood ties, but by bonds of love, dedication, and courageous choices. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. You help us continue bringing stories that celebrate the transformative power of love and compassion. Comment below which part of the story touched you the most, and don't miss our next episodes, where we will continue exploring the complexity